Right. Manish, let me start with you. Now, as a journalist, this is something that I'm very aware of. I call it we're in an era of the politics of anger. With these tough, difficult times politically, what should civil society be doing differently, and how can OGP play a crucial role in these polarised times?
And that is the question, right? That we're all thinking about. That is before this community and this partnership. And it's not an overstatement to say that how we respond collectively is going to be hugely, hugely important. It might be worth just spending a few seconds to talk a little bit about what politics of anger, and maybe unpacking that a little bit, because we don't want to oversimplify that. And there's various forms of, I think, populism and nationalism that are taking place in different countries around the world, whether it's what's happening in the United States or in India or in the Philippines or in the UK or in many countries around Europe. You're seeing a real reaction to the establishment, to government, to immigrants. You're seeing quite a strong reaction. But I would also connect that to a few other trends that we're seeing as well, looking at kind of fragility, conflict, migration, the refugee crisis, how people are responding to that. Poverty, the fact that we still have 700 million people that live on less than $1.90 a day. Increasing income inequality, climate. These things are tightly connected. And there's two kind of things. There's one where there is a very strong angry response, an anti-immigrant response, an anti-government response, an authoritarian response. And in this area, I think the challenge for us is to play really strong defense. We have to protect civic space. Civicus came out with some really alarming numbers about closing civic space just yesterday. 25 active OGP countries have civic space that has been kind of the freedoms of expression, assembly, and association that are seen as either obstructed or regressing. So we need to play defense. But there's also, and we need to recognize, some of that anger is because people don't have trust in public institutions. They don't feel that growth, globalization is working for them. It's creating more losers than winners. There's a sense of exclusion or marginalization. And in this case, we need to look at how we engage them more effectively, how we become more inclusive. The concept of co-creation, the concept of citizen-centric governance becomes absolutely central. So I think we need to unpack this and see, where do we play strong defense, and where do we recognize there's legitimate concerns that are being shown that we need to see how we can work with them to make governments more open, more inclusive, more responsive.
And Sanjay, coming off the back of that, I'm curious to know what your comments are.
Thank you, Annette. So pleasure to be here. I think, let me just pick up on Manish's points, and Manish has rightly stressed the need to protect civic space. Let me just build on this and look at the implications of these geopolitical developments for the OGP community, the civil society community here specifically. Let me just mention three things which I think are really quite vital. First, from Brexit to US to Moldova to Bulgaria and to many other parts of the world where there have not been recent elections, one thing that we have seen is that these results show deep citizen distrust of government, that they feel is ruled by an elite that is either living in a cocoon or is captured by special interests. There is something very directly that the OGP community right here can do to address that citizen distrust. But it will mean doing things differently. It will mean that we need to complement the work we've been doing on open data and transparency, which will continue to be foundational, to now make a big push on deeper citizen participation in policy making and service delivery, so they start trusting government. Genuine co-creation has been a very important theme for us, and it's a fundamental starting point. But we need to go well beyond that to not just having co-creation between government and civil society in OGP, to putting citizens in the center of government. That means citizens need to have a voice in policy making, and they need to have a voice in whether governments delivered the services to them. I'll give you an example. Inspired by Brazil, the South Kivu province of DRC set aside a line item budget that citizens would directly vote for. Civil society mobilized citizens. They voted for this line item. When they started seeing roads and schools being repaired, that they voted for, citizen trust in government grew and tax collection jumped 16 times. That is citizen participation and trust in government. Let us commit here that in the next round of OGP National Action Plans, civil society will advocate that every government will scale up civic participation in policy making and budgeting. That let us scale up. You heard Paul talk about the Philippines example, very inspirational, where government disclosed expenditures, civil society and citizens did social audits, the Commission of Audit responded, and they found ghost roads, which saved $300,000 each. Let us commit in this room that in every national and subnational OGP governments, we will have at least one commitment when the government commits to invite and respond to citizen feedback on services that affect their daily lives. That will mean open government that makes a difference in the lives of citizens. So that's one point I wanted to make. Second very quick point is we need to raise our ambition. You know, right here we are also launching the next strategy for the next 5 years, which shows that our ambition in OGP National Action Plans is quite limited. Only 17% of OGP commitments are seen to be transformative. And yet, given the kinds of electoral results we see, elite capture and grand corruption is a big issue in the hearts of citizens. But right here in OGP, we have inspirational commitments, which I would request you to scale up. Lobbying reform in Chile and Ireland. Transparency in political party donations in Georgia, where watchdog groups are using to track whether donors are benefiting from public contracts. Asset disclosure of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Ukraine, which is revealing glaring discrepancies. Can we not commit to scale up such inspirational reforms? And the last point I would make, my appeal to civil society, is this: focus on credible implementation. The most tragic statistic in OGP I have found is 61% of the most transformative commitments potentially are not completed. So you co-created it with government, but they were not completed. We need civil society to not stop at the development of action plans. We need you to monitor. The example that Paul gave on Italy, which was government EU funds, which were being disseminated to certain areas. Only when citizens started monitoring it bottom up, very much the point that Alina made, then they started finding that the funds that were for migrants or for poor communities were actually being captured by the mafia. Civic monitoring and implementation is really important, and so that's what I want to leave you with.
Alina, given what you've just heard here, sorry, we're just having a problem with it. Given what you've just heard here with these two gentlemen, and given the focus of your research, what do you think OGP's focuses should be?
Well, to be honest, I think it should, to follow up on this, the OGP focus first, it should be focused. I think I'm a little bit concerned, for instance, when I go to various organizations and I hear that since we have a refugee crisis presently, yes, we do, we have it, but I do not think it is the mission of OGP to solve this. We also have a climate change crisis, but I do not think it is the mission of OGP to hold this. I think that by opening everything of this will probably be helped, but I think you should keep focused because what you do is unique, nobody else can do it for you, and keep on that. The second thing, I think that, as this gentleman pointed out, you really need to go deeper. Let me return to my early revolutionary examples, right? Since I've been profoundly marked by being a 1989 revolutionary. What if I would have gone the minute after I heard that Comrade Ceausescu had taken his helicopter and fled? I would have called the Ministry of Propaganda and said, can we make a commitment that I am allowed to print my newspaper again? I would not have even found him. He was, hiding somewhere. I think that some things, you should not ask for them. You should just take them. And if you take them, it would actually make it easier for the government to offer them to you. And I'll give you, some examples that I've seen working very much on my experience. One are methodologies of assessing governments, local agencies, publicly owned companies, simply by their openness. In order to get more people, more citizens on board an open government, you have to show them how open government works, what it does. So in other words, to take like a parallel track to the classic advocacy track, you still have to do the advocacy track, but you also have to do a far stronger transformative naming and shaming track. Right? I do one thing, for instance, I come from countries where public universities are corrupt. I mean, don't misunderstand me, I teach in Berlin. That is not the country where public universities are corrupt. But in my original countries, public universities are very corrupt. So one of the things that I've done, you'll find a sum up in Times Higher Educational Supplement, I do questionnaires for universities. And the first thing I do, because it's easiest, I look at the openness. To what extent they give students what they should know in order later not to be asked by bribes, not to figure out that they can actually buy their dissertation from the market and whatever. So I send a letter to universities, and in this letter I tell them, I need these 35 documents from you. Some of them might be on their website. Please just give me the link in this case, in order to assess your integrity, right? Your first integrity rank is simply the number of documents that you send me. So there's a total of 35 points in this evaluation. If you give me 5, you'll get a 5. Right? And I can tell you that after 3 rounds, I have 100% good response. And despite the fact that at the end, most of these universities are corrupt, so I cannot give anyone top marks. Those who rank above the mediocres, rectors do show up and they climb on the stage of the National Theatre in Bucharest, very happy to get an award from me saying you are the least corrupt university, because I don't give them one in which I tell them you are the top university. This helps a lot. So in other words, make this openness methodology and the rating of commitments part of the way you deal with them, rather than having all the time this, confidential meetings where you advise one another on progress.
Okay, moving on, Manish, part of OGP's future is broadening the base. Now I'm going to ask the panellists, because we've got a lot of questions here, as it turns out, from audience. So we're going to have to punch along fairly quickly. But how do you actually broaden the base, Manish?
No, it's a very important question, and just, it is about how to protect what has made OGP so successful so far in its first 5 years, but recognizing, quite frankly, that it isn't yet living up to what it could potentially deliver. And to do that, I think we need to demonstrate more effectively how OGP can make a real difference in people's lives on the ground. And I think that does mean a little bit about broadening the base, and that means a little bit about the types of commitments that we put forward, that we co-create into the action plans, how we continue to stay focused on transparency and open data, but how we also begin to include more issues related to public services, to sustainable development, to things that really affect people on education, health, or water. It means also looking at who we interact with in government. How do we move beyond kind of the focal points to the range of ministries that we need to engage? How do we begin to engage more effectively subnational actors? And it means for our community, how do we also reach out to some of our civil society colleagues that are working on some of these other issues? And I think that if we could begin to identify some of those commitments and some of those organizations and some of those players that work on some issues where open government is absolutely crucial to get success, that we could do a lot in terms of more tangible improvements for people that would help us broaden the base successfully.
Let me just, Manish has addressed how we need to broaden the base to civil society, which is working on health, education, climate. We absolutely need to broaden the base. Let me just give an example of 2 other priorities, youth and women, which I think are quite central. I'll give the example of Tunisia, and the point I want to make is we need to make a value proposition for government that they need to broaden the base of their engagement to include these groups. In Tunisia, I was there a couple of months ago facilitating a cabinet retreat, and the big preoccupation on the Tunisian government's mind was the youth unemployment and radicalization of youth. Now, youth get radicalized not necessarily because they're poor. They get radicalized because they feel excluded and they have grievances, and that hends them towards radicalization. So what we said is, why don't you use OGP to actually co-create with youth commitments on their grievances, their pain points, and expand this. So that led to Tunisia, in their National Action Plan, creating a commitment where they're working with the youth platform, and the youth on their side created a whole network of youth civil society. So you actually have a broadening of youth engagement in that. We need to broaden to women. In Latin America, you have women of organized states. Latin America, OGP has been driven by very strong women civil society leaders. We need to have that in more countries. We have the Open Heroines initiative more globally. But we need to introduce commitments on maternal care, on elderly care. We see that in Mexico. We need to do that more. But the last point I would like to make is that as we look to expand the engagement with civil society organizations of this nature, let us also expand engagement directly with citizens using ICT, using the digital platform. Brazil had a very interesting Governor Asks program in Rio Grande do Sul, where the governor for health policy elicited direct citizen input on what were their priorities. Let us actually not make civil society the end, but the means to an end, and actually look to engage directly with citizens, leveraging ICT platforms. We can do a lot more with that.
Alina, given what I do for a living, that is host a women's program, I'm particularly interested on the issue of gender and in terms of involving more women in this process. How do you go about it?
Well, I think women are generally suffering more due to corruption, simply because corruption is about power. For who hasn't understood this, corruption is about simply having more power, getting more public resource. And this is why we actually find this nice positive association that women are less corrupt than men, which is not true in its essence. It actually simply means that when a society starts having more access, offering more access to women, it becomes less corrupt. It's one of the signs that it becomes less corrupt. It's basically women and minorities. Also, women need to prove themselves a little bit more. So if you let women do things, for instance, women who become chiefs of public agencies, for instance, tend to call in more audits than men. I don't know if you knew that. Because they want to show they are actually highly on virtue. They need to prove themselves. So I do not think that women need any special invitation for this. I actually think that women are among those who have the best interest, and we have to make an alliance, people who stand to gain out of more access. This is how successful anti-corruption work. Alliances of people who stand to gain. As I said earlier, parents who have kids in school, patients associations who actually want better health systems. This kind of alliances, I think, are important. This is the first alliance, and the second alliance is a donor alliance. Since unfortunately what we do relies so much on technology, I am not absolutely sure that somebody told Bill Gates that every computer cafe in a village is a direct contribution towards good governance, because there's somebody who can use it on behalf of the whole village. I think that putting everyone together to build up what we need there is another area where OGP can be very influential.
At this point, I'm now going to bring in questions that you have contributed to the plenary. First question to you, Manish, is from the audience. How will OGP actually master all of these issues on its plate?
No, it's so I don't think it has to master all these issues. I think what OGP needs to do is to do what its founding kind of strategy and principles, and be able to deliver on those quite effectively. The argument that I would make is that many of those things that are about open government speak to a much broader cross-section of issues. So if you think about health, OGP doesn't need to become a health expert or a climate expert. There are other communities that are out there that bring the technical expertise. But open government can make health delivery much more inclusive, much more effective, similarly with climate. That was in part when we talk a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals. About 2 years ago, there was in the last summit, the big declaration was about OGP being a powerful platform in which to advance the SDGs. And at that point in time, it was quite strikingly, the point was made that OGP was not just about Goal 16, which is the goal that was about governance. It was an instrument in which to deliver the entire agenda, because there was a recognition that open, inclusive, responsive decision-making government was absolutely crucial for the entire agenda. So I think what OGP needs to do is to do what it does exceedingly well, but to find out where to partner with others, where they can bring their technical expertise, their communities, their knowledge, and leverage OGP to create change. I don't mean to call out someone, but I'm going to. There's someone here from Save the Children that I've been speaking with over the last couple of years about how to bring Save the Children into OGP. I know Nora, she's somewhere probably out there.
Right there.
But just how, I mean, that is a very nice example of a different community working on children's issues, recognizing that OGP can be a powerful platform to advance their agenda. So that is how I would answer that.
Sanjay, rather, a question from the audience is how to avoid open washing, how to achieve the core issues of transparency and accountability.
So this is a real problem. I'll give you a statistic to demonstrate this problem. In the recently assessed action plans, we found that 70% of countries had no starred commitments. Starred commitments are those commitments that are transformative and completed. And so we have a set of countries that are doing really well, and we have a set of countries that are kind of muddling along, and there's some other countries that are not doing much. I think we really need to raise the game. We need to call this out. But I would also mention one additional point that I think is quite important, which is that, you know, when you have a phenomenon of open washing and a government is really not doing that much, you still have, governments are not monolithic entities. They have reformers inside government that are trying to do things. So one challenge I want to put forward, an appeal I want to put forward here, is for us to skillfully look for those reformers in government in particular areas that they want to make a difference and forge alliances with them. You know, this point on alliance that Alina made, fundamentally for me, OGP is a platform for reformers in government and civil society activists to join hands and overcome formidable odds. One frontier of governance earlier in the time was governments were going to do things, they didn't. The other frontier was civil society would hit government on the head and they would get government to do it. That also didn't go very far. OGP represents a cutting-edge frontier where reformers in government and civil society can join forces to find collective courage to overcome the odds. And that's what we need to do. We need, even in countries that are recalcitrant or not moving, we need to sort of look at those windows of opportunity, forge alliances to move things forward.
Alina, just coming off the back of what Sanjay was just saying, how do you address the lack of trust in government? Not to mention, and this is something as a journalist I'm very aware of, the facts themselves.
Well, here is where I actually think that, you know, we need a little bit of a more contextualized approach. We cannot discuss the trust in the whole world like one entity. Some people are right not to trust their government. Other people are not right not to trust their government. And in the end of the day, a government which thinks is virtuous and is mistrusted had made a very bad job at selling itself, right? So I am among the people who think that quite a larger number of people benefited from globalization than lost, especially in the poorer countries. Now, if some concentrated communities in UK or United States really lost out of globalization, it is the fault of those governments, now speaking as a professor of public policy, that they didn't think of an earlier way to compensate these specific groups, not thinking that these groups will be able to revenge themselves when the voting time comes. So we should not allow minorities who lost jeopardize something which is a bigger social welfare benefit. But you know, we cannot put them in jail. We simply have to give them something. And this is how you build trust. All right? It's unfair to ask you to pay for something which benefits the three of us. Let me think of something for you as well. So that is one way of gaining trust. And the other way of gaining trust, I think we should ask political elites to start thinking a little bit, you know, more conservatory at their own survival. There is a good way out there to win trust. You see it in Scandinavian countries, and I see it in Gendarmenmarkt, downtown where I work. It's enough for me to, you know, go 10 meters and I see Joschka Fischer pedaling away on his bicycle, right? This is the way to gain trust. I mean, we should get politicians out of Mercedeses and onto bicycles. We should make them, you know, take the subway at least once per month for people to see them and be able to tell them the most unpleasant things. Because actually, you know, it would do good to both sides. Unless politicians understand that there is only one group of countries in the world where trust is riding very high, higher than ever. And this is Northern Europe. What they do, we all have to do. It's very simple. Or people will just disappear and they will be replaced by other political elites.
Now, we're coming close to the end of the session, so I've got one final question here posed by the audience. And I'm going to ask all of you this one, so keep in mind that the timekeepers here are breathing down my neck. The question is, Sanjay, who is not here on this panel and in this room, and why? And how can you get them back here in 2018?
I think two sets of groups are not here that we need to get them back in. I think one set of groups are the kind of groups we want included, who need to be part of the base that can push for open government. Civil society that is fighting for health, education, save the children, etc. We need a lot more of that broadening. We need more youth, we need more women groups, and so on. That's one piece of a broader base of communities that we need. I would also like in this room to include those countries that are outside of OGP, that see OGP as a threat. And I want to show to them that open government delivers for politicians and citizens alike. We need to create a value proposition which shows this is not necessarily a threat. It's a way to empower citizens and for governments to deliver better. So we need those countries in the room who are right now, right now there is a demarcation, there is a wall that is beginning to form. And I would like them inside this tent to hear and inspire them and to show them that this can be a better path, a brighter path, which generates dividends for politicians and citizens alike.
151 years ago today, the 13th Amendment in the United States was ratified. It was the amendment to abolish slavery. And Abraham Lincoln at that point in time said, if slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. And I think when I think a little bit about that phrase today, I personally feel that if extreme poverty is not wrong, nothing is wrong. This is the moral challenge, in my personal view, that we face today. And the thing that I feel is I would love to see a bit more are those groups that are working on the front lines to really eradicate extreme poverty, to promote development. I see open government as a necessary, perhaps not sufficient, but an absolutely necessary platform, ingredient, to eradicate extreme poverty. So bringing this community and the kind of anti-poverty community together, for me, would make a real change in people's lives.
Alina.
Well, I am very, very optimistic, contrary to the current mood. I mean, I'm looking at a place like Myanmar. You know, a couple of years ago, we were able to organize with the help of Deutsche Welle when the regime started to liberalize a little bit, but it was still, you know, Aung Suu Kyi was under house arrest. But we were able to organize a talk show with her, the leading dissident there, from her house and our students, without image. A Deutsche Welle journalist had to take the image, put it in a bag and travel to the nearest border, which was 4 hours away, and only later we were able to pack the image with the sound. But the thing is, borders no longer exist. It might hurt us on refugees, but it does help us on our push for a more open world. If a country closes down, think that you can always organize a disclosure server outside that country, as long as journalists inside have stories to disclose and watchdogs have naming and shaming stories to say. Never consider that anybody can close up a country at this moment of technology and at this moment of history. They cannot. And we have to make them understand this. Also, maybe I got across as being a little bit anti-government here. you know, that's not the case. You have to understand that you can help reformers, but also in radical ways. When politicians threatened to close the integrity agency in Romania, the guy from the integrity agency came with one hard disk where all the fortunes of all politicians had been put. And he said, they're going to close us tomorrow. What do I do with all this? And I said, well, very simple. You give it to me and I'll put it on a server abroad. I'm out off to airport now in 1 second. But it was enough for us to say that we were going to do this, and they didn't shut down the agency because they simply understood it would have been ridiculous. The thing would have got on once the people had the idea that they can know how much politicians earn, and that was so important for them, and read on the internet. So let's just, you know, keep connected and help one another. There's nobody by oneself in this.
Alina, thank you for explaining the upside of the digital revolution. At this point, I'd like you to give a very warm round of applause for our wonderful panellists.